Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Alana Biggers. I am Assistant Professor of Medicine in the Department of Medicine and co-chair for the Department of Medicine Inclusion Council, along with Dr. Min Ju. Today we have two returning speakers, Dr. Joe Day and Dr. Henrika McCoy, who are giving us kind of a part two for our Department of Medicine Culturally Sensitive Care and Inclusion series. Today, they're going to talk about Tales from the Survive study, Victimization and Adversity in Young Black Males. So I'm first going to introduce Dr. McCoy. She's an associate professor and the interim associate dean for academic affairs and student services at the Jane Addams College of Social Work at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Her research predominantly focuses on strengthening the screening of mental health needs for justice-involved youth, examining the intersection of mental health and juvenile delinquency, particularly for African-American males, and the impact of violence on young Black males aged 18 to 24. Her research is influenced by her experience as a clinician working with children, youth, and their families who are experiencing a myriad of challenges, and has been funded by diverse sources, including the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the National Institute of Justice, the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. She currently serves as the Director at Large for the Society for Social Work and Research, as an Executive Counsel for the Division on People of Color and Crime for the American Society in Criminology, and on the editorial board for the Child and Adolescent Social Work. And Dr. Day, he has a Doctor of Public Health from the School of Public Health Division of Community Health Sciences from the University of Illinois, Chicago School of Public Health. He currently is an associate professor and director of the Community Health Program at Governor State University, and his research examines adversity on children and young adults in the subsequent development of chronic diseases, including cancer, the use of opioids, underage drinking, tobacco, and other substance use. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Henrika McCoy and then Dr. Joe Day.
Thank you, Alana. So Dr. Day is going to start off, and then I will pipe in about 2/3 of the way.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get started. So, good afternoon. Dr. McCoy and I will be presenting on the Survive study, which examines victimization in young Black men. My portion of the presentation will focus on the data set, which, without comment, So initially I thought that my portion of the presentation should focus on the data set without comment about the past and its relationship to victimization. But I soon realized that without discussion of the past, it would be impossible to address the topics of victimization of young Black males, since much of it is rooted in slavery and those events stemming from slavery. Many of you are clinicians. Would you attempt to diagnose your patients without taking a thorough history? I submit to you that the history we have been using to think about Blacks in general and young Black males in particular is at best incomplete. We cannot divorce the present from the past or the future. So during this presentation, I will attempt to redress this shortcoming by providing a brief but inclusive history of Black people in this country, and then Dr. McCoy will discuss the Survive study and the next steps. For some, the ideal of a multicultural America is intolerable. For whatever reason, some white people would not accept $1 million or more to be a Black person in America. I wonder why. There were 3 study goals to the SURVIVE study. The first was to develop and evaluate an instrument that could capture data about the violent victimization experiences of urban, suburban, and rural young Black men between the ages of 18 to 24. The second is to better understand the violent victimization experiences of young Black men by taking knowledge gained from pre-existing data and expand upon them by adding information that is not readily available in those sources. And lastly, to obtain information that will better inform policy, practice regarding the criminal justice system's response to violent victimization of young Black men. My portion of this presentation will examine the second goal. To this end, I will interpret pre-existing data collections, including a brief tour of relevant events in the historical record, a record that has been poorly disclosed so far. America was founded on white supremacy. This is not to say that all white people are white supremacists or are aware of this legacy, but because of it, the history of Blackness in America is very different than the history of whiteness. Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock landed on us, says Malcolm X. Our nation's founders believed in white supremacy and enacted laws to support a system based in oppression. I think it would be beneficial to go through a few of these statutes. First, the first slaves arrived in America around 1619. Between 1619 and 1865, Virginia passed more than 130 slave statutes to regulate the ownership of Black people. A 1662 law made all children of enslaved mothers slaves, regardless of the father's race or status. The rape by white slave masters could not create a free child. A 1667 law codified that slaves who converted to Christianity were still slaves. A 1669 law allowed slaves to be killed for resisting authority. White supremacy, or the belief that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion or detriment of other racial and ethnic groups, has its underpinnings implicit social cognition or implicit bias. From prey to super predators. Though during slavery, Blacks were seen initially as prey, after Reconstruction, young Black males were seen as super predators. This was due in part to white fear, as Blacks were given more rights. This led many whites to believe that Blacks were a threat and thus were more prone to violence and other aggressive behaviors and had to be controlled by any means, including lynchings and later the prison industrial complex. In fact, Charles H. Smith wrote in 1893, "A bad Negro is the most horrible creature upon the earth, the most brutal and merciless." This map demonstrates the many sites where lynching occurred. As can be seen, they did not occur just in the South. Our understanding of this time period can be attributed to the work of the African-American journalist Ida B. Wells, who led an anti-lynching crusade in the United States in the 1890s. In fact, during this period, white people were killing Black people at an alarming rate, as can be seen by the many police killings now. This map displays the sites of the 30 documented massacres of Blacks that took place before the Civil War, often in relation to attempted slave revolts, and after the war, the Civil War that is, in relation to tensions generated by Reconstruction and the later efforts to suppress Black voting and the institution of Jim Crow. So one way to organize this history is through a brief examination of the phases inherent in the interactions between Blacks and whites. I will first do a cursory examination of slavery, then explore systemic inequality, and finally offer at least a partial explanation of why I believe victimization has become a norm. So slavery. During the institution of slavery, the image of Black people, specifically Black males, was one of a docile character. There were the images of buffoonery, blissful ignorance, and juvenile angst, as they were seen as the primary traits of enslaved Blacks. However, slavery did not exist without oppression and violence towards Blacks, especially males. This was the rule, not the exception, though this violence is often forgotten. Reconstruction, the period between 1865 and 1877. This was a time when newly freed Blacks, particularly males, began to obtain social, economic, and political rights with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. In a sense, these rights reshuffled some of the resources that were primarily given to whites, but now Blacks, especially young Black males, had the right to vote. They had the right to not be enslaved. They were citizens. In fact, the first African-American congressman, Hiram Rhodes Revelle, who took his seat in the Congress in 1870. The political power of newly freed Black people created the conditions where poor whites saw Blacks as competition in the labor force. Also, there was the rise of Jim Crow. Then there was this fear of Black people who were once viewed as compliant or prey, but now they become savages and brutes. The new rights led to a growth in power and resources for Blacks that challenged white supremacy and created white fear of Black mobility. This led to more violence and victimizations of Blacks, especially males. This was the means to ensure power and resources remained in the control of whites. Systemic inequality. Wealth makes it easier for people to do all kinds of things. Transitions, life events, emergencies. If you have money, life becomes a whole lot better. It allows parents to take care of their kids, provides for education. In fact, it is the most complete measure of a family's future economic well-being. Systemic inequality has its roots in the white response to Reconstruction and the ever-growing fear of Black mobility. It is how Blacks were and are economically victimized, leading to an ever-widening wealth gap. What follows is a litany of responses of white fear to Black attempts to gain power and resources. Symptomatic of the white response to Reconstruction was the unfulfilled promise of the 40 acres and a mule. After the Civil War, many freed Blacks believed, after being told by various political figures, that they had a right to own land and they had been forced to work as slaves and were eager to control their own property. However, this was not the case. After Lincoln's death, after Lincoln was assassinated, they never received their 40 acres and a mule. This, in fact, was the first reparation for slavery. Unfortunately, it never occurred. The Homestead Act. The Homestead Act contributed to the wealth imbalance between whites and Blacks. It was essentially the first affirmative action policy, but it was for white people. Approximately 3 million whites benefited from this 124-year government-sponsored land giveaway program. Conversely, only 4,000 to 5,000 Blacks ever received land. It was an estimated $10 trillion land money transfer to white people. Jim Crow, our racial caste system, which existed for about 100 years from the post-Civil War era until 1968. It was a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation and, most importantly, the denial of opportunity. The New Deal. We often think fondly of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but for Blacks, he didn't do much. Some of the authorities and programs he created, in fact, refused to guarantee mortgages, for instance, for Blacks. The CC camps, which were places in his attempt to get America back to work after the Great Depression, he created CC camps. But these camps were segregated. The Social Security Act excluded job categories that Blacks traditionally filled. And in agriculture, what most Blacks from the South were really about, he reduced the land acreage. Now, he reduced it for both white and Black, but for Blacks, it was a massacre. So he did great things for the country, but he followed the traditions of victimization for Blacks that was customary during that time. Redlining. Redlining was a set of maps, restricted areas that reduced the ability for Blacks and other brown people to get credit to buy homes. It led to reduced home ownership rates, reduced house values and rents, and increased racial segregation. The effects of discriminatory credit rationing can have effects for decades. In fact, these policies led to the overcrowded neighborhoods in the Black Belt, where people lived in slum conditions without adequate resources. The GI Bill, again, another policy that helped whites. The soldiers who were in the Second World War came home. Many of them were able to buy homes, go to school. But for Blacks, this was not the case. So even though Blacks were entitled to many of the benefits of the GI Bills, if they lived in the South, they were denied them. Urban renewal. Again, another program that, if you think about it, your ideal is that this will help people. It's an opportunity to build things and make things nice. But what about the people who live in these places? Without participatory input from the people who live in the areas that were considered blighted and destroyed, what happened to those people? What we found out is that many of them had health problems once they had to move, and moving often was without any assistance. So I've talked a lot about, in my opinion, episodes of victimization that transcend the historical arc. This graph, I hope, will help us understand how this affects where we are today. So I entitled it, Our Racialized Past Predicts the Present. To me, slavery was the ultimate victimization, and it led to systemic inequality and to victimization being the norm. Because of systemic inequality, at least for African Americans, there's increased adverse childhood events. consider what poverty does to a family, what isolation does to a family. Systemic inequality creates pockets of poverty. It creates pockets of lack of opportunity, which unfortunately is associated with increased adverse childhood events. It also leads to increased chronic diseases. So it is no coincidence that African Americans have higher rates of heart disease, obesity, you name it. In fact, it is, without question, one of the biggest risk factors is just being Black. Also, when we think about what's happening on the South and West Side, where we're having increased social and behavioral problems, victimization. Hurt people tend to hurt people. Poverty often leads to crime. So again, the overall root of some of the problems, or many of the problems we're experiencing now, stem from slavery. So Dr. McCoy used the structural ecosystems theory, which is an ecological model. And she used it to provide a framework for understanding how our racialized past predicts the normalization of victimization. The theory operates through complex developmental processes, and we're talking here about microsystems, mesosystems, exosystems, and microsystems. And another way to look at those as the individual, the family, the community, the greater society. How these relationships lead to, for instance, the increase in carjacking that we're now seeing. So, for example, boys growing up in poor urban communities are exposed to high levels of community violence. In a recent survey, 75% of 10 to 19-year-olds in the Chicago community, we're not talking about somewhere else, we're talking Chicago, had witnessed robbery, stabbings, or killings. Added to this, most of these youth are also exposed to the tensions and struggles and sometimes fights in the home. On top of that, these communities have very low levels of social connectedness. And unfortunately, in many of these communities, the social norm is violence. Violence used to resolve conflict. And unfortunately, the consequences for this violence are often minimal. So the arc of victimization, extending from slavery through systemic inequality, leads to the normalization and victimization for young Black males. And given what they're exposed to, it seems logical. It seems at least this is the result of problems that remain unresolved. Impacts. So the impacts of our racialized victimization on Black males are physical. When we think of an injury or a chronic disease. If a child comes from a family with lots of issues, poverty just being one of them, substance abuse another, there's a high probability that there's probably going to be some injury and/or chronic disease. And we now know that the stresses and strains of poverty, of adverse conditions, have an effect on our genetics. There are emotional consequences. The emotions, the inability to deal with some of the issues that some of our children deal with can lead to mental health problems. And added to that, places like the city of Chicago decide that economically it makes more sense to get rid of community mental health clinics. So even if parents wanted to take their kid to get some help, there aren't that many available. And then there's the financial problems, the lack of employment, decreased rates of home ownership. So there are just not any resources needed to help deal with all the problems. And most of you know this. I'm probably preaching to the choir. But what is more interesting are the race-based barriers to accessing services and supports. Consider, I don't know how many of you are physicians or social workers. How many of your clients are young African-American males? How many of your patients are young African-American males? This is no coincidence. On some level, one has to be primed to be a patient, to go seek help. And that's simply not done in many of these communities where help is sorely needed. So I think I'm done. Enrica?
Thank you. So we are going to switch quickly, and I'm going to share my screen. So I want to thank Joe for kind of setting this up. So we're going to do kind of a hard switch on this. And what I'm going to do is present to you information from the SURVIVE study. So our official name for this study was Understanding the Violent Victimization Experiences of Young Men of Color, but we gave it an acronym, SURVIVE, because we wanted to recognize the fact that the young Black men in this study were surviving. They were not just violent victimization. They didn't just experience violence. So part of what Joe talked about was the trauma, and I want to get a lot more into depth about what that means. So why did we do this study? So part of the reason for doing this study was because despite the fact that young Black men are the most victimized by violence, there's very little actual data reflecting this. The official rates are collected by agencies like the FBI, but they're about very broad categories. In addition, there are real limitations to understanding these experiences because often Black men don't share what those experiences are. And that's not because they aren't interested in sharing, it's because they aren't asked. And so we wanted to make sure that we gave these young Black men an opportunity to talk about their experiences so that we could provide context about what those experiences are, which could ultimately improve service delivery and increase policies that would provide for service delivery. So there is a cycle that was mentioned previously that I just want to readdress. So we know that violence leads to trauma. That's just a given. Joe talked about kind of those risk factors being individual, familiar, community, environmental, societal, which we all know. We also know that those supports can look the same way. And so it's very important to understand what those risk factors are, but it's also important to understand how some of those risk factors are related to supports that we often ignore. There can be a real tendency to look to the negative and not to understand the positive. And there may be an individual who lives in a community where they don't feel safe, but maybe they have a family system that makes them feel safe, or maybe there are members of the community that make them feel safe. So it's important not to see one aspect and decide that that one aspect is into totality, the experiences of your patient or client that you're seeing. We also know that trauma leads to these very disparate outcomes. And although they're broad and apply to everyone, in particular for young Black men, we know that there are higher rates of victimization, which is what we're talking about. We also know that those high rates of victimization are often in tandem with engagement with the justice system, both at the juvenile level and the adult level. We know that there is a high rate of unemployment. That can be pre-violent experience, that can be post, that can be once you get engaged in the justice system, but we know unemployment is certainly a significant outcome. Mental health. Mental health can be because of the trauma that is experienced or the re-traumatization that occurs because of being engaged in a system and because of experiencing violence. And then once again, health, disability, and death are also related. Throughout this part of the presentation, I'm going to share with you quotes from some of the young Black men in our study because I feel like it makes more sense for them to share their words about how they feel as opposed to us. So we had focus groups throughout the state of Illinois as kind of the first part of our study. And one of the questions we asked is, what determines whether someone is a victim? And a young man said, sometimes it's survival. Sometimes you have to be like a possum. A possum plays dead for survival. And I just want people to think about that. I don't know how many of you, we live in the city. I have possums where I live. And I'll share a brief story that I think relates to possum that will maybe give you a visual sense of this. I was leaving to go to campus one day to teach my class. And I had that time had a yard service. And when I walked out my door to go to the garage, there was a possum laying outside the service door. And I thought, okay, I'm not sure if the possum is dead or the possum is playing possum. But all I know is that I'm a city girl and I'm not going near it. So I had to get to campus for class. I had to rush and find a neighbor to come and remove it for me because my thought was, if it's playing possum, that might not be good for me. And what I want you to think about is possums do that because they're trying to survive. They want someone to leave them alone. This is no different than what this young man described for himself, that he has to play possum so that he can just survive, so that he can be left alone. And it's not just from his peers or cohort, but it's from our greater society. And so that's a very important thing to understand, that he described himself as a possum, just playing dead for survival. So present day, as I mentioned, we know Black men are disproportionately impacted by violence. They're impacted more than any other group. It's not uncommon because of that violence for them to experience death or disability. We also know that young Black men are more likely to experience repeated experience of victimization, including multiple types of victimization of different kinds. And so as they are young, think people get older. If you start young, it continues throughout their lifetime. And so you cannot think about violence in just one particular experience. It may be additive, it may be duplicative or multiple. It can range from minor to severe. It can be across developmental stages, additive, independent, multiple times. It can be then demonstrated through aggression, risky behavior, recklessness. And the impact can be trauma and impulsiveness. It was mentioned early on when Alana did the introduction that I decided to do this work because of my own experiences as a clinician. I'm a social worker, and very early on in my career, I worked, my passion has always been adolescence. That came about as a graduate student. And I found my real passion working with young Black men. And there was one of my first jobs was working at a facility that was a day school and a residential facility. And the residential facility was all young Black males. We had a program for juvenile sex offenders, and we also had a program just for young men who were custody of the state or DOJ. And I was one of two Black therapists, certainly the youngest, not knowing technically what I was doing. But what I really witnessed was that our psychiatrist, who was a very well-meaning, very intelligent white woman, would often diagnose our clients with, the young Black men, oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD, conduct disorder. And I would look and think, that's not what's wrong. Those young men are depressed. Those young men have major depression, not just, something minor. There's some real issues here. But as a young Black female who was just starting out her career, not only did I necessarily feel like I didn't have the power to say anything, I didn't have the background or the ability to challenge her. But the fact is, what those young men were demonstrating was all the prior experiences that they'd had coming to fruition and how they were acting out. And so it's so important not to separate the child or the adult's experiences of trauma, of violence, if that has happened, from what you're seeing. And this so happens often for young Black men, where we know from data, from experience, that young white men who may experience some of these same things receive psychiatric treatment, but young Black men, their behaviors become criminalized. And what happens is their diagnoses become conduct disorder and not become major depression, which then deserve treatment. There is intergenerational trauma. And so Joe did an excellent job of kind of setting all this up. So this is just to remind you, and towards the end of this, that there is trauma. There's trauma that the Black community has experienced, and trauma that as a result, young Black men experience every day. It doesn't go away. We are reminded on a regular basis of the trauma that we've experienced, and it's passed on through generation. It's passed on through our stories, through our experiences, through our narratives. The picture at the top left, I purposely included because that's in Chicago during the Red Summer in 1919. The picture next to it is a very famous lynching in Indiana. And I can go on, but it's important to know that these stories, because people in our larger society may not be aware, it doesn't mean that people in Black communities aren't aware. And so we are very clear and often aware of the trauma that has been inflicted and that is continuing to be afflicted. The picture from the New Yorker, I include this these days in pretty much every presentation that I have, because I think it's important for people to see the totality of how Black people have been victimized, yet we are survivors, which is why this study is called Survive. It's very important that we don't define people by their victimization, but that we understand that it has occurred and what we have done to survive, and how do we then acknowledge that. We additionally have community trauma. We live in Chicago. We heard that there were 80 shootings this weekend. How traumatizing must that be? Not just for the people who were victimized, but for the people who live in those communities and for the people who live around those communities. We need to understand that the community trauma we're experiencing right now is both violence, it's racism, it's the pandemic of COVID-19. And we know that those things disproportionately impact Black people. And so as you think about community trauma, consider the circles that I have at the bottom, where we've got a pandemic of COVID-19. You have pre-existing trauma, pre-existing mental health issues that are often untreated, as Joe pointed out, in terms of the lack of ability to access services. And the positive of a Black Lives Matter movement, it's unfortunate that we need a Black Lives Matter movement, but that is a positive, and it is the largest civil rights movement known to this day in this country. But the fact is, the current reality is in the middle, and all of these things overlap. And so if you treat patients and clients and don't understand this, you are doing them a disservice in terms of how you engage with them and what you expect from them. And then finally, of course, is the individual trauma. Within all of that, within the generational trauma that's passed on, the community trauma that people survive, people have their own individual experiences, and they are not the same. We really sought doing the Survive study purposefully. And part of my real goal was I wanted people to understand that Black men experience violence, not because they did something wrong, but because they are Black men. And I think Joe did a great job of pointing out the historic experiences of Black people, and in particular, Black men. And so there is individual trauma that is inflicted because of this threat that has long pervaded in our country about Black men. And we can think about that related to how they were treated during their enslavement to how they're treated now. So we need to understand that they carry that forward. Just briefly, the study that we had included 18 and 24-year-olds. They were male. They had to self-identify as Black or African-American and had to experience one of those categories. A couple may seem odd. We included military violence purposely. Young Black men go into military service disproportionately, and many of them come from communities where they've already experienced violence. And people fail to understand that we are sending them into situations where they may be re-victimized by violence. And so when they come home and they come back to you for various healthcare, it's important to understand what those issues are. This is a study that was cut short with the change of the presidential administration, but the original study was 3 years. There were many, many aspects of this study. I'm not going to go through them, but you should know that we did a national study. We recruited in lots of places. We were embedded in the community. We hired people in the community to do interviews and to recruit in the communities that they lived. We hired Black men only. We felt that was important, that participants understood we validated who they were and understood that their experiences could only be understood by Black men. Even as a Black woman, I certainly didn't feel qualified for them to relate to. So we were committed to making sure that every young Black man in our study felt heard from by a Black man. You'll see this is really just the first part. We had 158 screeners. We ended up with 72 people. But I included this slide to show that at the top, physical assault, school violence, and gang violence were extraordinarily high. There were other areas, but those were high. You can see just kind of the breakdown in terms of we had 11 on the south side, 12 in the south suburbs, north suburbs. So we were kind of all around the city. And you can see how they were recruited. They were not all unemployed. People were employed. The assumption is Black men don't work. We had Black men that worked, and they were representative. Many were not married, but they were also not fathers of 10 kids. Many had no children. Many had college education. Many were working. So we felt those things are very important to show, once again, that violence for Black men is about being a Black man, not because they did something wrong. We asked, how do you define violence? I define it as an overload of passion and raw shame aimed at a target to control your environment and the law. Madness, violence is violence. You can't stop it. It's going to happen to you. It's going to happen every day. What kind of violence do Black men your age experience or have they experienced? I was just going to say, really, what kind of violence are we not experiencing? That is probably the better question. And I want each of us to sit back and think, is that the answer that we would have? Because it's certainly not the one that I would have. I don't expect to experience violence, and I certainly don't expect that any kind of violence would be what I would wake up to every day. Just you'll see from our respondents, from the screeners, just kind of the range of violence that was experienced across the board. So everything from physical assault to sexual assault, jail and prison violence, hate crimes. All of these are things that are still present. And I just want to note, this study was in the last couple of years. So this is not an ancient study. This is not something that happened so long ago. This is data from within the last couple of years where young Black men in Chicago and throughout the state are saying, this is what happened to me. I think each one of us sitting here is a victim. We each have a situation we don't want to be in. It's hard, it's rough. Some of us haven't chose that life. Life chose us, basically, is what I'm saying. And so we want to make sure we point out the things that are really important, and that if we don't address these issues, we will continue to see the same patterns and the same people show up in our offices. We know that we have underfunded, unavailable, and inadequate health services, mental health services. We know that we have poor services that talk to each other. I do mental health, I do child welfare, I do juvenile justice, and when I'm talking to colleagues in those areas, we always say, it's the same kids. That's really crazy. It's the same kids, and it's the same kids in systems that don't talk to each other. And if they talk to each other, we would see significantly better outcomes. So we need to do a better job of that. And we need to make sure that we engage healthcare with that, because we know that our kids go into these services, go to the hospital, go to the ER, go to see their doctor, and never the twain shall meet do the social worker and the doctor, or the teacher and the doctor, or the teacher and the social worker ever talk. We have to move away from that, because then we are providing inadequate treatment. We know that we continue to provide inadequate referrals. We continue to underdiagnose, undertreat mental health needs. We also have in our society some real negative messaging about the value of Black men. You only need to turn on the TV to see that. The only value that we want to see of Black men is if they can go shoot a hoop, play some music. We don't have value for what they really have to offer, and that's really hurting our society. And then we know that we live in a city that is segregated. Some say it's the most segregated. I've lived in other places. I think that maybe that's different, but we live in a city of segregation. And it's important to remember that often people of color, Black people in particular, live by race, not by income. And that is because in some cases, they prefer to live by people where maybe they're risking life and liberty than they would to live in a place where they're clearly unwanted, where they have to experience the trauma of racism, which is significant. So we have to think about the segregation that we have and how that impacts opportunities and access. And then finally, safety. Obviously, we live in a place where safety can be not so clear. And when safety is not clear, it makes people not be able to move forward and be able to receive support and services. So what shouldn't you do? You shouldn't invalidate or require proof when a patient, especially a Black male, shares their experiences with violence and victimization. You need to believe them when they say they didn't do anything wrong when they were victimized by violence. You don't need to keep questioning and make sure they're not leaving something out or they're lying. And you need to remember that experiences with violence are traumatic and additive, likely to already existing intergenerational and community trauma. You were seeing something not in isolation, but something that is a part of something else. And what should you do? You need to increase your knowledge. And you need to read something beyond white fragility, beyond how to be an anti-racist. I think it is very important that you understand that reading becoming familiar means becoming uncomfortable. Just reading the things that make you feel like you're learning but aren't pushing you to think about the role that you play will not be able to move you forward to be the kind of supportive clinician that you want to be. Be open to learning and hearing new things. Don't assume that because you know what's right, you're woke. Quite frankly, that's not an option. Really understand structural violence. And we have Cher here at UIC that is really excellent about helping people to understand structural violence. You want to not turn a blind eye to state-sanctioned violence and racial terror that we see on our TV every day. And finally, I like to remind people it's a privilege to learn this versus live with it. And if you get to learn it, then you have the opportunity to do more, because you don't have to wake up every day and worry about the trauma and the violence that you might experience that's going to negatively impact your life. So in the words of one of our participants, I like to end with, how do you define being a victim? Have you ever been to a circus? You know how you'll be watching the people on the tightrope. You know how you get that feeling in your stomach because you think that you're going to fall? Just imagine that feeling never going away in every aspect of your life. To me, that's what being a victim is. That feeling that you can't exhale, you can't defend, you can't grow. Every time I see somebody angry, I don't ever just jump to conclusions like he's just angry because he just wants to be tough. When I see it, I think about that gasp of air and he's just trying to exhale. He's sick of holding. He's just trying to exhale and he's going to try to get his exhale anyway. If he can't get it with the end dudes, he's going to get it with the little dude. He just needs to feel that breath. That's what being a victim is, that feeling. So I have to obviously acknowledge my funder, my co-investigator, our project coordinator, research assistant, all of our team. And Joe and I want to thank you for being here. Hopefully we left a little bit of time for some questions and discussion. Please feel free to raise your hands and unmute and ask your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Day and Dr. McCoy. That was really very interesting and a needed discussion. Thank you. Any questions from the group?
Hi, this is Min.
Oh, okay.
Hi, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk again. Part 2 of the.
Oh, Min, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I said thank you for coming back and speaking again on behalf of DOMIC. I really enjoyed your talk, part 2 of our series, and I hope that we can continue. As I'm listening, one of the things I always think about is how do we use this information in the context of every patient that we see in the clinic. And I know we've talked about this before, and I think one of the things that we have certainly been working on, and I know Dr. Finn is on the call with us now, is also to improve our efforts to recruit Black faculty as well, so that we have more representation seeing patients. But for the majority of us, I mean, if you could give us maybe 1 or 2 pointers or advice to think about every time we engage with our patients, please, just a couple things that you think that everybody should think about as we sit down and engage with our patient population.
Well, I'll say from you as the social work perspective, our motto in social work is you always start with the client is at. And it's important to know your patient is the expert of who they are and their experience. And so often we forget that. I have a friend, not a Black male, a Black woman who's in the hospital right now, and she's struggling with her doctor because he won't listen to her describe what she is saying is the problem. Because he is the doctor, he thinks he knows better. And we know from research that Black women, Black people are often ignored when it comes to patient care. So what I would say is understand that the person in front of you may not have the medical terminology, but what they have is the actual experience. And if you don't listen to them, you will fail to be able to provide them service and fail to develop trust. And you cannot be a healthcare provider of any sort if you don't have the trust for the person that you're providing service to.
I would agree with that, Henrika. And I think for me, the most important part of the patient-clinician relationship is the development of the relationship. And so, yeah, I ditto that.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, this is Elizabeth. I'm Dr. Joe Day's daughter. I'm currently a
Good to
fourth
see
year
you,
medical
Elizabeth.
student. How are you all? This is a great talk. I wish we had this. Just had a quick question about what's going to happen with your study. I heard that you said you lost some funding due to the past administration. So what's going on with that?
Well, fortunately, your father, Dr. Day, is trying to work with me to move some things forward. We had a number of things happen. The previous administration was not invested in this project. So the funding was, and other things, the funding was ended. So we did not finish the way we planned, but we still did manage to get quite a bit of national data. It was a 2-phase study. So we have lots of data. We have both qualitative and quantitative data. The whole point was ultimately to develop an instrument that would measure victimization, which we were able to do. We did some pilot testing during the study of that instrument. So over the next however many years, we will be rolling out kind of the qualitative component as well as the instrument. The goal of the instrument was to make it available both for research as well as for clinical use. We have a website that I often have when people email me. It's on the bottom of my signature. So we will post that instrument. People can use it. It's got various types of violence. It includes a life history. And so the whole goal is to use it in any way that people can, just to begin to understand the violence that the people that they have in front of them experience. So thanks for asking.
I do believe Pam Meadows, she has her hand raised. You want to come off mute?
Dr. Biggers,
Hi.
allow me. So, hello. Pleasure and thank you for this presentation. So, I'm a part of a professional book club, and we're reading White Tears, Brown Scars.
I have that on my bookshelf. I've not read it, but I have it on my bookshelf. I can see it right here.
It's interesting because the pleasure of reading this book amongst BIPOC professional women, it's become a hybrid of a support system, a book analysis, as well as anti-racist initiatives, like what can we do to change? So I wanted to give you that context because one of the things that came out was white guilt and how to approach navigating that in a systematic racist system, but most importantly, in engaging with people one-on-one. And so long story short, one of the things that we equated white guilt to was like a addiction or a disease like alcoholism, and without stigmatizing it. So with that said, how do we approach, because we associate so much with the stigma of, oh, a Black male, and that when we come across the hurdle of white guilt, what can we all do? And I do mean we as in those that are white, those are white allies, those that are not white allies, those that are BIPOC. What do we do when we see as a response being white guilt and addressing and resolving this kind of dynamic? I hope that gives, I know that's a very loaded, dense question, but
well, I'm going to take a stab and Joe may have a different answer. Hopefully, I don't know if my answer is going to really answer. I hope I understood. But my first immediate response to that was white guilt is often used as a weapon. And I think it's important not to allow that to happen. I think that white guilt is often used to throw people off and say, see, I understand and I feel bad, so don't blame me because I want to help. Now, that's and people know I'll pretty much say whatever I think about most things, including this. So I think it's important to call people on that and to point out that it's not about guilt. It's about what are you doing, what have you done, what are you not doing, and what you should be doing. Guilt doesn't move anyone anywhere. And that, quite frankly, the call of white guilt is to please feel bad for me so that you don't have to call me on my behavior. I have a presentation I did a couple months ago. I don't know how many people, I hate talk shows, but there was a talk show, what is it? The one with Sharon Osbourne and what's her name? Oh my gosh. She's a UIC graduate. She's a Zeta. What's her name? Somebody help me out.
She's the Black comedian, and
Yes.
she brought up the situation with
Yes.
the British reporter. I know exactly what you're
Yes.
talking about. And
And
it was, yes.
And I show that clip in that presentation because she's saying, I'm not calling you a racist, I'm calling your friend a racist. And the first thing Sharon Osbourne does is cry, get mad, and say, don't get mad at me. She used her white guilt to weaponize the experience of being called out on the fact that she was openly supporting a friend who was racist and engaging in racist behavior. And so that is the kind of thing that often happens, because then we as Black people feel like we need to take care of somebody. That's an enslavement mentality. That's not the one we need to have now. So I'm going to stop there. I could go on about that all day. So I'm going to stop.
Enrica, she's right. We probably have a different view on this. However, I think that it's about comfort and discomfort. And some people interpret their discomfort as, it's not my problem. That was in the past. Some people interpret their discomfort as whatever. And then we have to interpret their discomfort as something. I agree with Enrica, it's not my problem to get caught up in somebody else's discomfort, because the truth is the truth. And we need to move away from whatever mode we're in. I think our biggest problem is that we're only now beginning to understand the breadth and depth of slavery, what it has done to America as much as it has done to individual Americans. And so people are just going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. That's just one more phase. And the hope is there's enough discomfort so we can eventually, this human experiment will succeed, because right now it's one step forward and 2 steps back. But at least we got that 1 step forward. And I don't know if that answered your question, but hey, that's my take.
This is an ongoing conversation. So in many ways, yes. And also as one of my favorite go-to phrases, and it's to be continued.
Yes.
So yes. And let us continue with the conversation, the actions that fuel that. So thank you.
Thanks for asking that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I want to thank Dr. McCoy and Dr. Day again for being here today and giving us that wonderful presentation. And I also wanted to give a moment to Dr. Finn to give a few words and thank her for supporting the Department of Medicine culturally sensitive care and inclusion series that we've been putting on for over the past year. So Dr. Finn, any final words? And
You're muted.
You're on mute, Dr. Finn. Dr. Finn, you're on mute.
There always has to be someone on mute, so I take full responsibility. It's always my fault. I just want to say I'm very moved, and I will never think about a possum again. The madness of violence, or that I can't exhale. So powerful. I really want to thank our speakers. I appreciate each and every word. I appreciate how tough this is. I wanted to let you know that the Department of Medicine Inclusion Council, led by Alana Biggers, Minju, with input tremendously from Lisa Butler, we are trying to grapple with these tough decisions and discussions. And I'm telling you, we are wildly uncomfortable. And as Alana had said, it's not, healthcare is in our lane. Structural violence is in our lane. It's part of us, the healthcare providers. And I thank everybody who is here today participating, regardless of background or experience. And I love the words that Tim Lacey just said. It's all about action. So our job in the DOMIC, the Department of Medicine Inclusion Council, is not only inclusion, but information and implementation. So welcome partnership. And as I know you are well aware, what we are grappling with, even as we talk about advancing folks of color within the healthcare field. Right now, we have a huge crisis for Black men. If we look at the numbers of Black men who are entering medical school right now, it's probably less than 1973. So there's a very important issue that is going on, that it's in part for all of us. We're all in on this. So I passionately want to thank you and step back and appreciate really everybody sharing, and most of all our speakers.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.